This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with JC Swaan, who teaches at Princeton University. He's also a partner at Cornwall Capital, and is the author just recently of this book called Seeking Virtue in Finance, Contributing to Society in a Conflicted Industry. So JC, the title, Seeking Virtue in Finance, I guess the main question that most people would have is, how much seeking do you have to do before you find some virtue in finance? And you take a virtue ethics lens to the profession of finance. And I think, the idea of virtues, one virtue is to do your job really, really well, I suppose. But if, Alistair McIntyre is right, then, being really, really good in the finance profession is like being a really, really good thief. It's not what we would normally think of as a virtuous life. But I think you're trying to suggest that you can find virtue in a life as a finance professional. So it must be more than simply, being really, really, really good at what you do. What motivated this inquiry? And then, maybe we can talk a bit about how it even makes sense to start teaching these things to, I think you teach freshmen a course on ethics in finance, right? And I'm always thinking, wow, I've taught this course on financial ethics to financial engineers who are much further along in their career and they understand a bit about finance. But freshmen, is there an advantage to kind of getting them before they actually know what finance is, or is it better to kind of come in after somebody's already learned a bit about finance?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on your podcast, Greg. And so there are a lot of topics you raised here, but let me start with freshmen, which there's no one I'd rather teach than freshmen, particularly in the fall of their freshman year, because that's when they're the most excited and they're energized and they're incredibly curious. And so for the last 12 years, I've taught this as a freshman seminar. I also teach other courses, and so I teach the whole gamut because I teach seniors and grad students in the spring, and I also teach at a business school at Cambridge. But to me, freshmen are the most interesting to teach because I can learn more from teaching freshmen than anyone else, right? So there's something pretty self-interested here. Because if, I'd be curious about your experience, but when I teach, say, MBA students or MFin students, it's, in some ways, it's a little transactional. Like they want the knowledge, they want the skill set, and it's almost like training peers in a way at a work site, younger peers, people who are new to the industry, but the questions tend to be very targeted, very practical. The freshmen tend to ask fundamental first principle questions. And that's what makes you rethink everything often, right? And so it's been a huge privilege for me to do that. I also think it's useful for them because I get to pick my students. They apply to be in the class. And I'm not necessarily only focused on students who are interested in being in finance, but I generally want that diversity of views. I want like half of the students who are going to be, those who, since they were 12, they woke up early to watch CNBC and they're trading their own portfolio and they're really gung-ho about the end, and they know the language and all that. And I want the students who are super distrustful of the industry and don't believe that it's a force for good. And my fundamental belief is that it's a force for good, but that to some extent it's deviated from that over the years. And so I do think that having teaching them early is helpful because frankly a lot of the case studies that we do and a lot of the courses case study based resonates as well with first year undergrads as it does with grad students. Now, to your point about why did I engage in this project, why did I start teaching this, and why did I write the book? My entry into the industry as an investment professional really is from the point of view of economic development. I studied economic development as a grad student, and I was always interested in this concept of finance as a tool for prosperity and as a way to spur economic development. And so I was in grad school in the late 90s, and that was at a point where we were just starting to see research in that area. Because prior to that, finance didn't really figure at all in the economic development conversation. It was seen as part of the plumbing, but it was seen as kind of peripheral to it. And then you have a few academics in the 1990s, one from the World Bank, one at Brown, that started delving into what are the externalities of finance. And you start realizing that there are huge positive externalities, like positive effects of finance. And that really is what spurred me to delve into it. And I wanted to test it out. And so after grad school, and I worked for a few years in management consulting, I moved to the buy side, and I wanted to invest in emerging markets and to test it out. And I think it took me a week or two to realize that doing long short equity in Asia would literally have zero impact on these economies and societies. And and we were trading. This is really the secondary market. We're trading equities with other hedge funds, and the company's kind of far removed from this, and certainly, these communities are far removed from it. That spurred me to try to understand this topic better. And so that's when I'd always had a passion for teaching, so I created this course, and that was my kind of pathway towards this. And now I should mention the book itself, I think came from a conversation I had during the first semester that I taught the ethics course with one of my undergrads. Halfway through the semester, one of the students comes to me and says, "Why is it that when we talk about ethics and finance, why is it that we always focus on unethical behavior and bad outcomes? And why not also focus on constructive behavior and perhaps even inspiring individuals?" And I thought about it and I thought, wow, yeah, that is true. We never really focus on that. And surely there must be some learnings from it. So I set out to look for that literature, could not find it. And so I thought, wow, this is I love this idea of learning from others. And so I went out and researched ethical role models. And this was a 7-year project in a sense. And that became a silo of this course, a small silo, but an important one. Mm-hmm. And I eventually wrote this book, and the idea was to write the narratives for these individuals. So there are like 60 individuals and firms that I write about, but also really tease out lessons from them. And what I did is tease out a framework of what a virtuous life might look like in the finance industry, but not being naive about it, being fully cognizant of the huge constraints that you have when you work in the finance industry, the enormous pull from incentives. There are extraordinary incentives in many corners of the finance industry. And so try to understand this and put it together as a little bit of a roadmap, as much for me, frankly, as for my students and for anyone in the industry.
Yeah, it's funny. When I taught this course on financial ethics and regulation, we spent all of our time talking about the bad actors, right? We talk about, all the Jerome Kerviels and the Lehman Brothers and all the, behaviors that were, ethical and illegal, would go back and forth. And it was all about, how you design bad incentives and you get bad outcomes. And we never talked about virtue. We never talked about, the good life. And it's
Yeah.
weird because you say you're a finance professional, but the word professional has a distinct meaning. And I'm a lawyer, and we have a course called professional responsibility, and there there is a sense that when you're a lawyer, it's not simply about ambulance chasing or whatever. There's this idea that you are contributing in some way, that there's this vision of
Yes.
being it's a noble profession in some ways. At least that's some people want to believe that. And the outside view of lawyers is very different, but the inside view is that there is this nobility in being a lawyer, and that you make sacrifices to be a lawyer, and that there are these ethical principles and guidelines that you're supposed to follow. But it's enforced by a bar association, and there's disbarment as a sanction, which kind of reinforces these norms. And you have similar kind of professional responsibility in other occupations like architecture, and even in journalism, even though they didn't have a way of disbarring you, right? There's this notion of professional responsibility. Why do you suppose finance has not had a coherent notion? FINRA has exams that you have to take, and you have to have a license and so forth. But it's really about knowing the rules, and less about kind of cultivating a sense of public service. Well, why do you suppose that is? And in fact, you mentioned in your
it's
book,
a good question.
you mentioned in your book that when you ask people who are professionals, what they think of in terms of their public contribution, they're often caught off guard and are somewhat speechless. You mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's been, to me, an interesting observation. Over the years, I've hosted many finance professionals, many fund managers in my class. And one of the questions I love to ask is, how do you contribute to society through your work? Like, in what way is it helpful to society? And I don't mean it in a way of, trying to put them on the spot. And it's more to try to understand, like, tease out, like, what are the positive aspects of what they do. And interestingly, for a profession that is, so here I'm talking specifically about fund managers.
Mm-hmm.
So for, a class of professionals that tends to be really cerebral, and that tends to be, well-read, and that in my experience, and maybe it's anecdotal, but over the last, dozen years or so, they're often stumped. And then they'll revert to, we make markets more efficient, which, there's some truth to that, of course. We serve our customers, and our customers are helpful to society. So they'll pinpoint, some of our clients are research institutions and endowments and schools and so on. And we help them generate excess returns. We help them generate alpha. But I've never been convinced of these answers for different reasons. I mean, one of them is that, certainly making market efficient is helpful, but as an individual, it's hard to really argue that you're having a real impact here, because the impact is so diffuse, right? Like, so in and of itself, like, I think it's a little bit hard to justify. Now, serving your customers, and to your earlier point in the question, in my mind, there's no higher mandate, right? This is our professional mandate because we're in the business of serving customers. So there's nothing that's more important than serving your customers' interests with their interest in mind. Now, what I find in the industry in general is the challenge is that that's often defined a little too narrowly,
Mm-hmm.
which is only serve your customer without any consideration for what the implications might be on the rest of the world, right? And so this is where I think, and interestingly, the industry has made some forays there and some progress in recent years, and with the ESG revolution that's underway, there's been more thought devoted to that. But in general, I find that it's not necessarily like people are bad actors. It's more like they have a too narrowly focused lens. Now, to your point about why is it that we see a little bit less of that oversight in a way in the finance industry, where it's not so much oversight, it's almost like peer pressure
Yeah.
or peer incentive. I'm not sure why that's the case. I mean, certainly there are there's the CFA Association, which I think does a lot and has done a lot in recent years to move in that direction, but you don't see it as much. And my biggest, I think my entry point into this topic of ethics and finance is this idea that finance tends to be played as a complex game with its own rules. And as long as you play within these, well-defined, narrowly defined rules, then it's a force for good. And finance professionals, by and large, tend to be a little unquestioning of the fact that what is good for them is good for their clients, and what is good for their client is good for them. And then as a result, it's good for society. But we know that that's not the case. And certainly, the global financial crisis is a great example of why that, if you leave it on its own, it's going to create problems.
Well, you mentioned that at one point in intellectual history, people thought in terms of productive and unproductive economic activity, and and of course, I think there's you could think of this as a Marxian view, or it's a bunch of different perspectives that endorse this division, and then you point out how the marginal revolution kind of eliminated that division. I think there are plenty of people today that would embrace that division, and there are plenty of people that think that the financialization of the world is not a good thing, and that there's productive real economy behavior, and then there's kind of financial rearrangement of the chips. And I hope we can get into that a little bit. But when we go back to this idea of professional responsibility, there seems to be two components. If I think from the lawyer's perspective, one is that when you look at the relationship with the customer isn't always right. In other words, it's not just that you have a
Right.
split responsibility to the client and then to the sort of the court system or the external world, but even with respect to the client, giving the client what the client wants isn't always doing what's best for the client. And sometimes you have to say no to the client. And when we talk about some of these toxic financial instruments, and we think in terms of subprime lending, and we think about kind of the opaque credit contracts that maybe some people are signing, or when we think in terms of late fees and overdraft fees and so forth, I think a lot of finance professionals would say something like, "Look, who am I to judge, right? I mean, if the customer wants it, then the customer wants it. I mean,
Yeah.
even if you think about like Robinhood, I think the people who founded Robinhood, they thought, hey, we're democratizing finance. We're giving access to people that normally they wouldn't have access to. We know that investing in equities is better than leaving money under the mattress. So we're helping people to do this. And then if it devolves into like the crack cocaine of investing, right? I think people are kind of
Yeah.
caught off guard because they think that, hey,
Absolutely.
if somebody's paying for it, they must want it. It must be good for them, right?
Yeah, and this Robinhood is such a great example. I remember a year ago, over a year ago, I gave a midterm exam to my students, and the midterm exam is a research paper, and I asked them to identify an ethical role model. It can be an individual or firm, and describe why they're an ethical role model. What are the trade-offs that they face? What are their incentives? So try to provide a nuanced perspective on them. And one of the papers came back, and it was Robinhood, the founders of Robinhood, and the student argued they're ethical role models because they're trying to democratize finance. And at that point, I wasn't so familiar with Robinhood, and as I read the paper, I thought, I'd like to look into it myself. And of course, when you delve into it, my view was that it was hugely concerning the way they approached it, and the way I think about it is that, what as you think of your professional mandate, and to your point, it's not just giving to clients anything they want, but it's also promoting the kind of products that you would suggest to members of your family or members of your tribe, or people that you actually cared about, right? And so this idea that if you are promoting a product that you would never want your children to buy, for instance, or your mother, or whoever you really cared about, then that's a red flag, right? And in this case, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't want necessarily people they really cared about to trade all day and become day traders. And so there's this challenging situation where on the surface, it's positioned as a force for good, but when you look at the dynamics, it feels very negative to me. And so it's
Yeah,
an
but
interesting dichotomy.
I want to push back on that standard though, because then that becomes, it becomes very non-empathetic, right? So your tribe could be very different. I mean, when you think about lending,
Sure.
micro lending is like whatever, 50% a year interest rates. And you think, well, I would never want my kids to borrow at 50%. But, some of these people, the only alternative they have is 300% from the local, money lender.
Yeah.
And so like, if you don't understand their context and their position, then
Oh,
you're
absolutely. Yeah.
right. So how do we, how do we engage in thoughtful fiduciary behavior without being kind of paternalistic and judgmental? I mean, I think about casinos and how casinos convince themselves that they're enhancing the customer experience by making it,
Right.
allowing, people gamble longer and longer hours. And this is customer loyalty, right? As opposed to,
Yeah.
I mean, should you just shut down your casino and walk away? Or, I mean,
No.
how
No. Yeah.
how do we
It's
reconcile this?
it's a tough one, and I think ultimately it's a great example was the CEO of U.S. Bancorp.
Mhm.
So in the run up to the financial crisis, he it was one U.S. Bancorp was one of the very few banks that decided not to go into subprime mortgages. I mean, they did it, but in a very timid way. And at board meetings, he would say, I want everyone to review their portfolio of products and to check whether there's any product there
Mhm.
that they would never sell to anyone they cared about. Assuming that, that person had to your point, that person had the same kind of profile and preferences and interests that, and so there's a certain element of self-restraint, I think,
Mhm.
that's necessary. And that's always a challenge because there's a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is going to be short-term profits. But at the same time, that trade-off becomes a little bit less meaningful in terms of, narrow self-interest, in terms of profit, if you look at it over the longer term, because I mean, for instance, U.S. Bancorp is a great example of a bank that dramatically outperformed all the other banks when you look at it on a long-term basis. So there's an element of self-restraint. There's an element of regulatory safeguards that is critical. And I think, the way I approach my topic in the book is by being very clear that it's just one aspect. It's not a comprehensive solution to all the problems that finance have or has. It's more it's one element, one pressure point and it's really a mosaic of pressure points that are going to push the industry into, a better direction.
Yeah, I'm interested in how should we be thinking differently about maybe say retail products and wholesale products, right? So when we think in terms of, these usurious credit cards with all sorts of
Yeah.
tripwires that kind of trap people in cycles of debt, versus say the abacus example.
Yeah.
So, you walk through the abacus example, and this is where, Goldman Sachs was essentially brokering a transaction between someone who was shorting subprime mortgages, John Paulson, and the folks who then wound up, being sold the opposite side. I mean, every investment bank is going to be sort of selling to both sides, right? And so, how can we evaluate that? I mean, should they be saying, hey, we actually think this is going to go down, and we have other clients that think it's going to go down, and so while you're taking this position, I mean, we focus on the Abacus case because it ended up so poorly, but there may be plenty of other examples that wound up going in the opposite direction from the way in which the bankers intended. I mean, if the bankers thought that the housing was going to go up, then should they have refused to allow John Paulson to initiate his side of the trade?
Right,
how should we be thinking when we're dealing with sophisticated investors? Doesn't the argument that the customer is always right sort of have more kind of credibility?
Yeah. So I think you're right in that you can't approach retail and institutional investors in the same way. And even within institutional investors and retail, the level of sophistication is very important in the way you deal with folks. And in retail, my sense is that there's so many egregious cases of people taking advantage, or firms taking advantage of customers who just don't have much financial knowledge, right, and ability to understand what products they're buying. And you mentioned the credit cards, and there's so many examples of credit cards marketing their most complex products to the least financially literate customers. And of course, these are the higher margin products for them and the ones that more financially literate customers would never agree to, right? And so, and my sense is that this is where regulation becomes extremely important. Now, on the institutional side, I mean, you mentioned Abacus. Abacus is interesting because it's not, I mean, to your point, there are a lot of other situations that have worked out very well. Of course, there is, in some ways, a lot of emphasis on Abacus because it's so well documented, right? I mean, there was such a huge congressional inquiry into it. So it's a little bit of a gift for researchers because now you see all the internal emails and the like step by step. And so it's a very useful tool. And it's one that I use in the class. So we do a 3-hour case study on Abacus. And it's one, where I start with, okay, so here's an individual or a couple, and they're buying a house. And so they take a mortgage from their local commercial bank, and here's what happens to the mortgage. And, and it's then sold to an investment bank who turns it into residential mortgage-backed security. And then it's sold to another one who turns it into collateralized debt obligation, and then it becomes a synthetic CDO. And you can see how, and what's interesting about this is every step of the way we try to analyze the decision-making process of the individuals involved. And it's almost never the case, at least in this particular situation, where you would say, wow, these are awful people. They were trying to extract value, and they were trying to fleece someone else, right? It's often the case that there were fairly sophisticated people that were often well-meaning, but they had a very strong set of incentives, and they followed them in a narrow silo, right? They were very focused on their narrow interests without thinking about the ramifications. And it goes to the point that a lot of unethical behavior in the industry is actually not so much bad people, but it's often like good people that are very sophisticated, but that are oblivious to the consequences of their action. And that points to the importance of cognitive biases. And I think the industry is particularly fertile grounds for cognitive biases. Now, with Abacus, I think it goes beyond, though, simply, well, it was okay because they were dealing with sophisticated investors. The there are a number of angles there where they just fail to be transparent about what, and it goes to, very simple, basic professional guidelines that, any investment bank has, which is, like, for instance, they sold the long side of a CDO to institutional investors, but they did not mention that all the underlying mortgages, or not all of them, but more than 50% of them, had been handpicked by the short seller. And so, of course, there was a bias in the portfolio for mortgages that were less likely to succeed. There was also like a clear effort on their part to go after institutional investors that were less knowledgeable about this area, and that we're not going to ask the tough questions. And there was also, again, lack of transparency and this idea that they implied to their customers on the long side that Goldman was also on their side, which wasn't the case, of course, because they were massively short these subprime mortgages as a firm. So there, it's a complex case that has a lot of interesting aspects and nuance. And I come out of it thinking, well, these are not bad people. And in fact, what's fascinating to me is that a lot of the people that you see in there have this same background as my students. They might have gone to Princeton. They might have gone to, they might have, I don't know if they would have taken the ethics and finance, but they, they're well-meaning individuals. And what's interesting is the bias that you have because of where you sit. And I've had conversations where, when you look at some of these case studies, anyone sitting from the outside, it's a little hard to justify their actions. But those from the inside are absolutely gung-ho that it was absolutely fine, right? And I think ultimately it has to do with all sorts of biases that we have.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how, the bias literature has crept into ethics. I interviewed Max Bazerman, and of course, John Haidt teaches a course at NYU, and the emphasis is on, our psychology and how we're, we wind up doing things that we might not recognize ourselves if we were to step outside of ourselves. But I think there are plenty of people that say, hey, listen, this is a game, right? And the idea is to test the rules. I mean, if you're playing football and you do a head fake in order to get the defender to go left when you go right, like, that's not unethical. And if you're engaging in puffery, or you're bluffing in a negotiation, that's considered to be sort of part of the game. And so I think a lot of people would challenge this idea if you say, well, you need to think about the long-term consequences, or you have to think about it from a utilitarian perspective. It's so complex that it's almost impossible to think through all the different. I mean, the more complex it is, the more you just have to focus on, your little silo and your little role, and you've got the rules set out for you, and then you do your job. And I think even in the law, we would say that, right? I mean, if you're a lawyer, your job is to defend your client, and whether they're guilty or innocent, whatever you think about their guilt or innocence, your job is to just defend that person and trust that the system as a whole, will come to the best outcome, as long as you play your job, right? Or if you're the soldier on the hill and you're told to take the hill, you're not supposed to think through, well, how is taking this hill going to impact the overall war effort? You've got to trust at some level that the general has thought this all through and has a grand scheme in mind. So how are you, if you're just one of the soldiers down there on the field, how are you supposed to think through kind of the ultimate impact? I mean, if you're doing an interest rate swap, I mean, are you supposed to somehow think, well, this is going to have this impact on global welfare, or do you just say, hey, I'm gonna do my job?
Yeah, no, I mean, these are great points. And for the vast majority of what we do in finance, it's hard on a day-to-day basis, decision by decision basis, to make that kind of distinction. In fact, my book is not about decision making on a day-to-day basis. It's much more about how you manage your career over the long term to be virtuous. And I think if you step back, today the industry would, I think everyone in the industry would agree that you should serve your customers well and with their interests in mind. Now, not everybody does this, but the idea of trying to extract value from your customers or fleece your customers, not a lot of people would defend that. And most people, even if you were very cynical, you would look at this and say, well, it's probably not going to be a sustainable strategy, commercial strategy, right? Because over the long term, you're probably not going to do well, and it's going to come and bite you back. Where I think there's a lot of debate, and to your point is, well, if you're serving your customers well, now do you also need to think about the rest of the world? Like, who am I to opine on what the impact is going to be? And besides, if I'm the junior analyst at Morgan Stanley, who am I to bring this up to the MDs or to the VP or And you're right. I mean, it's tough, and in some ways, I think that over time we will be more sophisticated about understanding this. This is a nascent field, and in some ways, ESG is an important force in pushing us to understand what are the externalities of our everyday decisions. But in my mind today, the most we can do is to figure out what the extreme cases, in a sense, right? Like the extreme cases, there's this example that I like because that's one where there's that clear kind of bifurcation between serving your customers well and extracting value from the rest of the world, where and so it dates back, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, the governments of Italy and Greece came to investment banks, and specifically JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. But and I don't want to pounce on, that's not the idea at all to highlight any individual investment bank, because there are more proxies for the industry as a whole in this case. And they said, we have a problem in that our level of sovereign debt, national debt, is going to go above the threshold that's mandated by the European Union. Can you help us out? And so the banks came in, and they were able to make it so that in the statistics that were reported by Italy and Greece, it showed as if their level of sovereign debt was below that 3% threshold. Now, in reality, they did a lot of financial engineering, and ultimately what they did was really mask the fact that they were above it. They obfuscated. And so when you step back, you'll say, well, here's a situation where these investment banks, they really serve their customers' interests as the customer defined it, right? Really well. And this is why, the client should pay an enormous amount of money to these banks, because it's super rare to have that combination of, very sophisticated understanding of regulation, very sophisticated financial engineering skill set, right? So there are only a few firms that could have done that, and they did it. So they were successful, and big success. Now, if you step back, you would say, well, that can't be great for the rest of the world if what you're doing is you're helping obfuscate how much, how indebted you are. And in fact, you fast forward a few years to 2011, and you have this massive Eurozone crisis that's really a debt crisis because a lot of these countries are too indebted. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that the investment banks, are responsible for it, but this is one where you would have wanted someone in the higher echelons of the bank say, wait a minute, we don't want to be in the business of doing that, right? And so the extreme cases, I think there's an argument for the more pedestrian day-to-day cases. There's a lot that you can do even at junior levels, but it's not necessarily to lead your personal vendetta, I would argue. If you're the first year analyst at JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, I'm not, I'm not advocating my students that you should lead the revolution from day one, because it's probably not going to be effective. There are all sorts of other things you can do as a first year analyst that are going to be helpful and consistent with your values, I think, but not necessarily like trying to, wage warfare.
So, you reference greenwashing in the book. And I think, one of the cognitive biases that we have is our ability to kind of describe to ourselves virtually anything we do in a positive light. And so, even these bankers who helped Greece avoid the debt limits, they could presumably have convinced themselves, hey, we helped this country to avoid austerity, right? We helped them to, hey, if we didn't do this, they would have to, create a recession, and they'd have to have a bunch of unemployed people, and it would be a disaster. So we're going to buy them some more time to kind of get their house in order. How do you prevent yourself from falling into these traps where you just select your benchmark, select the one that makes you look best, right? I mean, this seems to be a natural human tendency.
Yeah, and I guess the broader question is how do you try to prevent these cognitive biases from creeping into all your decisions? And you mentioned Max Begerman, and you mentioned he's one of the folks that I've read the most closely over the years. I've assigned blind spots in my class for the last 12 years. I think it's a fantastic book. And in fact, I listened to the podcast you had with him recently, which I thought was great. Yeah. So the question is, what do you do about it? I think there are steps that you can take. And in fact, I think this is the next kind of stage of my research, is to try and understand how do you implement these things internally. But one thing you can do, so say if you're facing that decision at Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan about Greece, I think checklists would be an interesting concept to develop more widely in the industry. I was really inspired by what Atul Gawande has done in medicine. And as you probably know, he's been instrumental in having surgeons adopt these simple checklists, and it's had an enormous impact, apparently, on medicine and in surgery. And of course, in finance, it wouldn't be kind of as clear cut, because there's there's more nuance probably to it. But I suspect that if we had a systematic policy of having checklists for decisions that are above a certain threshold of materiality, and the important thing is also to write it down. And I think that makes a big difference, because there are a lot of things that you can justify to yourself and to your colleagues with kind of not really discussing them, and by not really laying them out on paper. And you become kind of lazy, and you take intellectual shortcuts. And that allows you to really not think about like externalities or consequences. But if you had checklists and you actually had to write down what you think the impact of that decision is going to be on this stakeholder and this stakeholder and this stakeholder, I think that could be a force for good. And at a minimum, I suspect it would help weed out some of the worst decisions that banks might have to do. Now, of course, there are big trade-offs, right? And because the clear trade-off here is you're introducing bureaucracy. And that's a challenge. The other thing that I think is helpful with cognitive biases is because it's so ingrained in the way you think about things and the way your group thinks about it, and it's so determined by where you sit, having external advisory boards review certain decisions in a way that can be separate from your everyday processes is that can be very helpful too. But again, I mean, you're introducing big trade-off because you're introducing bureaucracy now.
Yeah, ethical
but
bureaucracy.
I think there are ways to do that.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
so I think there are analogs here between kind of risk and compliance, right? So, we have chief risk officers or chief compliance officers, and they're focused on kind of the illegal
Yeah.
aspects of things. So, would we need something kind of similar to that? And those folks have their own challenges, and when times are good, they
Yeah.
generally get kind of pushed further and further down in the bottom of the organization. But isn't it more than that? I mean, isn't it more
Oh, yeah.
about
It's yeah.
creating like when I think about branding, a really effective branding philosophy within a company is not simply about having a chief marketing officer create a marketing campaign. It's about every single thing that the company does has to be on brand, right? And so
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you create a kind of an ethical framework, it's kind of it has to be reinforced sort of at a peer level. It can't simply be that there's this person up
Oh,
there
absolutely.
at the top of the hierarchy, right? So how do you create that? And you've highlighted a number of examples of individuals that have demonstrated ethical leadership, but I think one of the things that they've done is they've created organizations where this culture of ethics pervades every aspect of the
Yeah.
organization.
Yeah,
Is-
and I think ultimately, I mean, it has to come from the top because the top has to model that behavior because there's a vast difference between the code of conducts and of business conducts that are adopted officially and the actual behavior internally. And what individuals are going to model is what their bosses are doing, right? And so it's the emulation is critical. So the modeling your behavior against folks that are above you and who are really there to assess your own performance, and also the way people are rewarded and incented. And you see if people who cut ethical corners or manage to do it in a way that's successful internally and are rewarded for it, then it makes no sense to have to talk about like any kind of business code, ethical code, because that's going to trump anything else, right? And so that's why like it's interesting. John Whitehead, who was the co-senior partner of Goldman Sachs from the mid 1970s to the mid 1980s, um, was a big proponent of that, and of course he introduced the business the code at Goldman Sachs, which was a model for a lot of the industry back then. But it was also, I think, supported and it was really buffered and by the fact that John Whitehead and John Weinberg at the top and all the senior partners were modeling that behavior, and they were strict in terms of doing more than slapping the rest of those who cut
Mhm.
ethical corners. And my sense is that it looks like there might have been some erosion of that over the years. But it's so critical that the those on top are able to model that behavior because everything else is meaningless.
No, I think he's the one that talked about long-term greedy, right, as opposed
Yeah,
to short-term greedy, and a lot of people are attracted to this idea that hey, ethical behavior pays off in the long run, right? Whether at the institutional level or the individual level, and you reference Adam Grant's work, and this offers up a really attractive proposition. It's a Panglossian world, and when my students are asked to choose between you know, higher economic payoffs and, ethical outcomes, my students will always respond by saying, well, why not have both, right? Like, and it's
yeah,
like, wait, hold on. That would be great if there were no trade-offs, but I think the Aristotelian perspective that you emphasize in the book suggests that, look, there's always going to be trade-offs, right? And that
yeah.
being ethical is not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to,
Right.
maximize your economic performance, that you have to ultimately make difficult choices. And I think there's a tendency for people to try to, avoid having to make difficult choices. And the way they do that is through some kind of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, that's a critical point in my mind. I wish I could have written the book about how to be more ethical and more financially successful, and how they're entirely consistent. But I don't believe that to be the case, because a lot of our world is still driven by short-term performance, short-term incentives,
Mm.
and and until we move those structures and those incentives, you have to live in the world that we're in. And so that means that in some cases, not all of them, but in some cases, there are going to be trade-offs. And that's why, to me, when I look for ethical role models to document and to understand better and to analyze, I wanted to find people who are self-interested, because people don't necessarily relate to altruism. So
Mhm.
self-interested, ambitious, and successful, but successful in their own ways. So some of them were successful in traditional ways, but others, they're successful because for them, being happy is also living the good life. And living the good life is about contributing to the world. And so it's important to not necessarily assume that there are going to be no trade-offs, because there are trade-offs.
Mhm. Well, one option that's often proposed is, hey, listen, if you want to make the biggest impact in the world, why not just go and get as rich as you can? And if that means, ripping off customers and employees, whatever, just do what you got to do. And then you can give all this money to charity, right? Isn't that
Yeah.
sort of a better way of making an impact than sort of, refraining from playing this game and becoming a school teacher? you know,
Right.
isn't the best way to make a big impact is to get filthy rich and then create a foundation? I think that
Right.
this is the sort of focus of the fourth part of your book.
Yeah, so this is interesting because there's a fascinating school of thought that you're familiar with, of course, because I've heard it discussed in some of your recent podcasts. But effective altruism, and of course Peter Singer is kind of an important core of it. But Will MacAskill is an Oxford philosopher that I've hosted in my class a number of times, and he wrote a fascinating paper in 2011, 2012. And his argument is incredibly provocative and seductive, which is, if you want to do the most good in the world, you shouldn't work for Teach for America. You should work for Goldman Sachs, right? And but what you do is you live. So the original argument was you live like a grad student, and whatever
That's pretty hard. That's pretty
excess.
hard to do. I
Yeah,
remember
so there's a
one of the things
practical aspect, which
one
is
of the
hard.
things I was worried about when I was had the opportunity to go work in investment banking when I was coming to the end of my grad student days, and I was concerned that so many of my friends who had gone on to work in investment banking were complaining that they couldn't afford the mortgage on their vacation home and stuff. And I was thinking, wow, that doesn't seem. Do I really want to?
Yeah.
How do you prevent the norms of the industry from kind of changing who
Yeah.
you are? It's kind of hard to
Yeah.
live like a grad student when your colleagues are not.
Yeah. Well, it's actually, it goes beyond that. It's not necessarily changing who you are as much as changing everything about who you are at that stage in your life. If you have a family, then you can't live where everyone else lives. And so there's a trade-off that's going to affect your family, right? And whether you go public school, private school, and so on. But it's an enormously seductive argument. And in fact, so in my ethics course, we do a whole session on the ethics of career choice. Are there
Mhm.
career choices that are more ethical than others? And ultimately, even though the argument is extremely seductive, I I'm not completely bought. I haven't bought in the argument, because I do think that as individuals, we're driven by our passions and our interests and our preferences. And I do think that those that want to do the most good in the world are just not going to be very effective working at Goldman Sachs. And I also think that there's a practical element to it, which is it's incredibly hard to actually implement consistently over the years. Um, Now, this being said, the effective altruism movement has introduced a lot of nuance to their argument over the years since that original paper. But it's still the case that I do think that, if you want to do good in the world and you want to be a nurse, there's nothing, very few people can do more good than a nurse. And so for me, my heart sinks when at the end of a semester, a student comes to me and says, I love your course on ethics and finance. I wanted to be a doctor. I'm going to go now. I want to be in finance. And this is absolutely not what I'm trying to advocate for or suggesting. But for those who are going into finance, they can have a huge amount of impact because finance is so pervasive to our society. And in some ways, the ethical role models that I write about, they're not heroic for the most part. It's nothing like the nurses and the doctors that have taken care of us during the pandemic or the frontline workers that held the fort during the pandemic. It's much more pedestrian, but it has a huge impact on society.
So I want to ask you about ESG. This is something which I spend a lot of time working in this area I work with pension funds and, we run programs and sessions and seminars on the topic. And I've always been a little, puzzled by the idea that the best way to make the impact is through, say, shareholder activism as opposed to participation in the political process. Because if we think about, we want to move past carbon, and so we use shareholder democracy to try to get companies to change their behavior. But wouldn't it just be so much easier and more effective to say have a carbon tax, right? I mean, like why if we're able to make that kind of impact on a company, shouldn't we be able to make a similar impact in the political process? I mean, why?
Yeah.
Or when we think about say Google, the Google is refusing to help the U.S. military, but the U.S., I mean, the majority of the American people have, decided that they, want to have a military, right? So, isn't it profoundly anti-democratic to refuse to help the American military? I mean, if we're trying to do the greatest good for the greatest number, shouldn't we respect what the majority of the people have actually said that they want, right? How do we reconcile this?
Yeah, but in a way, and maybe I misunderstood the question a little bit, but I don't see it as antithetical. Like I don't see it as, we do a fair amount of shareholder activism, constructive activism.
Mm-hmm.
So it tends to be very friendly, longer term. And in my mind, it's a real force for good in the sense that we can help the companies become more productive. We can improve the governance. We can potentially improve their ESG performance. So there are all sorts of things that we can improve at the company level, which has, my belief, all sorts of positive ramifications on the corporate sector, on the economy, and so on. At the same time, if you ask me, what's the hierarchy of tools to make society better, I would put regulation before shareholder activism, but I don't see them as being in opposition because it's not like I do shareholder activism, but I oppose regulation. I actually support more thoughtful regulation at the same time, and carbon tax and there are all sorts of ways in which you could improve the current approach to the environment. So I don't see them as being in opposition. I see them as part of that kind of, like mosaic or pressure point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and so I want to ask you about culture, because at the end of the day, you mentioned in the book that incentives, you can't avoid incentives, right? Incentives are what drive things. And you can have an overlay of ethics, and you can have an overlay of promotion of virtue and peer norms. But at the end of the day, incentives are going to be very, very powerful. And so when organizations state an interest in protecting their customers, protecting their employees, doing good for the world, but the incentives are driving their individuals in opposite directions, it's going to be difficult to maintain. And I've been affiliated with organizations that talk a good game, but you look around and you see that the people who are getting ahead are the Jeff Pfeffer's assholes, right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah. This is a fascinating concept, depressing concept.
Right.
But yes.
So how if you're within an organization that believes very strongly in the promotion of virtue, how do you make this contagious? How do you both as a leader, I think it's probably easier if you have a mandate, but if you're sort of not in a leadership position, maybe you're aspiring to a leadership position, how do you kind of promote this idea of virtue in all of its different
Yeah.
facets?
So, I mean, there are different ways to do it. I think, I mean, if you think of the toolkit, certainly the one that would have the most impact is revising your incentives, and you can revise them. So how you can revise how you compensate people by introducing some ESG components, in a sense, to your compensation. But there's also, things that could help the culture that you can introduce in your incentives. For instance, the way in which you're helpful to your colleagues and to your employees and so on, or people on your team. You could reward followership internally, and there might be ways in which you can measure that. And that was something. So I worked in McKinsey for 5 years, and that was something that was very high on the list. Now, of course, it's incredibly hard to get right, because as much as I have an incredible amount of respect for McKinsey, for instance, and in fact, I write about some of the things that I think are wonderful about its culture and the way it assesses performance and so on in the book. We've seen scandals recently, right, coming out of McKinsey that have tarnished its reputation. So, I mean, that goes to say that it's incredibly hard to get right. But so I would say, like, financial incentives, the way people are promoted, the more you promote people that I think exhibit the kind of behavior that you want to model, and that is about contributing to the broader society, the more everyone else is going to want to do the same thing, right? And in addition to that, as I mentioned, I think checklists could be a force for good as well.
Another example was Wells Fargo, and you mentioned how
Yeah.
the CEO had a very positive reputation for integrity, and yet
Yeah.
presided over this super corrupt incentive system.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and this is a great example because it comes from a good place.
Mhm.
And in fact, I feel I was part of it. I never served Wells Fargo when I was in management consulting, but I served other investment banks in the other banks. And I remember that was at a time when value-based management was the rage. And what we did is we would go inside these banks and we would say, okay, what's the ultimate goal? Well, the ultimate goal is to raise the share price over long term. And so how can we model behavior internally so that everything is tied to that? Right. And so there's kind of there's an appealing elegance to managing an organization along these lines, and you can do it in a way that's very analytical. It's incredibly disciplined, and this is what Wells Fargo did. But of course, if you do it in a way that where your focus on it is so intense and siloed, and you don't step out of your shoes and think about, well, what are the unintended consequences of this? You get a situation where you have millions and millions of fake accounts that were created in order to reach goals that, and it goes back to an incentive system that had gone out of control and was, in the end, incredibly engineered, but not thoughtful.
Yeah, well, I think it gets back to this idea of, serving the shareholder like serving the customer. The shareholder isn't always right. And, the share price response in the short run is motivated by actors that may not have complete visibility into, what's actually happening. And so, just like a doctor needs to know exactly what they're giving to the patient, the manager needs to understand kind of what they're giving to the shareholder and what the impact is going to be in the long run.
Yeah, and also I think if you're managing a company, there's there is a discussion to be had around, well, do you manage with a view that you're going to cater to those who are playing the quarter versus the longer term shareholders, the asset managers that might have invested in you with a 5 to 10 year view, and and are you able and willing to take the short term volatility by doing the right thing, even though it's going to disappoint a subset of investors that, in the hedge funds that might have disproportionate short term or disproportionate impact in the short term.
Well, JC, I think this course that you offer is fascinating. I think business schools should certainly start thinking about how they can offer a vision of the good life to their students. I think we kind of nip around the edges without explicitly talking about what it means to live the good life. But I think this is something that should be part of our curriculum. I think it would be crazy that you could spend 2 years, say, in an MBA program and not have to seriously address, right, why you're alive and why you're living and what are you doing and how does it
Right.
align with your ultimate objectives. So I think this is a fantastic vision that you've offered. I definitely recommend the book, Seeking Virtue in Finance, Contributing to Society in a Conflicted Industry, and I hope that you will write some more.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.